listen with intent, listen with a open mind to understand what the employee is going through, give them the space to do that. When a person genuinely feels that someone is caring authentically about their experience, they're more likely to share.
Exude Human Capital hosts Hold On, Let Me Close My Door, bringing real HR stories from real professionals with real solutions to you. Join us as we navigate the ever-changing workplace with Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner, Exude Human Capital, and special guests. Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. I'm Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner here at Exude Human Capital, and I'm thrilled to have with me my co-host, Romaine Jones-Wise, one of our fabulous senior consultants. Hello, Ro.
Good morning. How are you? It's good to see you.
It's so great to see you, and I'm so happy to have you as a co-host today. And one of our fabulous guests for the day, the Chief Wellbeing Officer of Exude Inc., Carla Chin. Welcome, Carla.
Thank you for having me. It's like bonus. I get both of you. It's awesome.
I can't think of two people better suited to have this conversation today that we're calling It's Okay to Not Be Okay. And this is really in observation of Mental Health Awareness Month as a way for employers to think about what's happening in the workplace today, how it's impacting employees at all levels of the organization. And very importantly, what are some of the things that employers can do to make the workplace more accepting and welcoming and helpful to those who may be experiencing mental health issues in the workplace. You know, before we get started, I would love for each of you to share with our listeners a bit about your experience, particularly as it relates to this space. So, Ro, may I begin with you? Do you want to talk a little bit about the work you do and how it relates to this topic?
Sure. I have the privilege of being a human capital consultant, a senior consultant with Exude Human Capital with a progressive career in human resources for the past 20 years. And in my career, I learned that to be able to be helpful to an employee, you have to see the whole person. And seeing a whole person requires that you ask questions that are not normally the typical question to ask about, employee performance. So I lead all of my conversations with, how are you today? And I really want a genuine answer from people. And that has become something that I am known for, that I like to see the whole person before I interact for business. So, very happy to be here as part of this conversation today.
And thank you for joining us, Ro. Carla, can you share a bit about your background?
Sure. This is one of my areas of passion. I wear many hats in my role at Exude. The deliverables that we have leaned towards a lot of this topic around mental health, resilience, psychological safety, right? Just really tapping into the core human needs. So when I think about mental health and well-being, it's really simple through my lens, right? It's how do we help people get those needs honored of feeling seen, feeling like they matter, feeling safe, and then really building support around that. So I think sometimes we overcomplicate solutions or approaches, but if we really lean into what we need as individuals to thrive, to flourish in our own roles within our organizations, right? And just kind of using that as a launching point in terms of how we approach all things and really being able to rehumanize our experiences. I mean, that is, just an amazing opportunity and where a lot of solutions and outcomes can come from.
And from the work that I know that both of you have done and are doing, I look forward to hearing you share examples throughout our conversation today of what you've seen employers do, how they've done this well to really, and perhaps leave the audience with some tips on what they can do to help individuals and to both your point, care for the entire individual, the whole person. Before we get into our conversation, I want to share some statistics. And many of you may have heard these before, but these are current. These are 2024 and rather astounding, if you will. 74% of full-time employees in the U.S., according to one recent study, say it is appropriate to talk about mental health concerns at work. And that's a big bucket. When they say appropriate to talk about mental health concerns, there are a lot of variables in that. Only 58% say that they feel comfortable sharing at work. Ro mentioned, starting conversations with asking how people are. In this study, some people said, I am asked how I feel, but I don't always feel that it's authentic or that someone really wants to know. It's just something that they do. And lastly, 7 in 10 senior level employees say they have not received workplace training about how to talk to their team about mental health. We also see that show up in actions leaders take when they're taking care of their own or dealing with their own issues and not quite sure how to be able to effectively lead by example or demonstrate by example. So, Carla, why do employers need to be paying attention to mental health in the workplace?
Because mental health and psychological health affects everything that we do and how we show up, right? So to not address that, I mean, just from purely, productivity and profitability, risk mitigation, like there was that whole business case, right? That I'm sure we could spend hours discussing. But as humans, and to Bro's point, and I love that you shared the whole person, right? You cannot park that part of ourselves at home and expect that our needs not getting met, that support, the struggle, silently struggling, right, isn't going to somehow affect client deliverables, interpersonal dynamics within the workplace, right? It affects everything. And so it's a huge missed opportunity. And from just a pure, I care about you message to your employees, right? I think that goes way more further than anything. So it's really in all angles. I think it's to not address it is to not, really be able to, create those flourishing teams and, experience those outcomes that, we expect that we're achieving when we're recruiting folks, when we're seeing their resume full of accomplishments. That's assuming that person has the needs and the support to be able to, show up in that way.
I know that we've had, quite a whirlwind the last few years. The pandemic exacerbated or brought to light conditions that perhaps people were effectively dealing with prior to the whole change and that whole set, and perhaps created more anxiety or feelings of depression in others. I know we also have a rather negative national social discourse that is contentious. And I think the days of, when you enter this building or you turn on your computer, gone is your personal life. And here you are at work, and that's the way you're supposed to show up. What has changed that has made this focus on mental health so prominent today?
I mean, it's the increase in folks struggling, and it's gotten to the point where you can no longer hide it, right? And I will say, I think there is some positives as far as even just the normalization through media, or we can call it social media, and folks, being able to communicate, whether it's people you watch in movies, sharing their own lived experiences, leaders and organizations courageously sharing their own struggles. I've witnessed this firsthand in meetings when we've done like mental health awareness sessions, and a leader boldly sharing, right? And just the awe and just the whoa, it's almost the jaw-dropping impact, but in such a humanized way, and it changes the energy and how people feel and kind of gives them permission to be human, right? Because these are high-performing leaders sharing, gosh, I struggle with, mental health challenges, or I've had lived experiences. So think there's more conversations happening, but also, when people are silently struggling, especially in fully remote, sort of workspaces, and also in hybrid settings too, right? In arrangements such as that, it becomes more evident. Like, people are like, where's, I haven't heard from this person in a while, or maybe even just following up, or we have clients where employees just haven't been showing up, period, in person, or in residential homes if they're are doing, work in the communities. So, I think that's really part of it. There's almost like a contagion effect as well. And burnout, given that, that's also related to this, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about that as well, has been on the rise. So I think I wouldn't say mental health challenges and this concern didn't exist pre-pandemic, but it's certainly amplified, really shined light on it. And the risk factors, from when you think about what are the risk factors for mental health challenges and disorders, it's constant change and uncertainty, all right, and traumatic events. So it's, even if it's vicarious trauma, right? It doesn't even have to be your own lived experience. It could be vicarious trauma, just watching the news all day long, not knowing what's going to happen, hearing about other people's lived experiences of trauma. All of that has an effect on our psychological health.
Very interesting. Ro, I know that you are working with clients on a regular basis from the human resources perspective and from the DEIB perspective. How have you seen this show up in a workplace?
One case that I can remember off the top of my head, what we thought was a performance management issue with one of our clients and one of their top level leaders, we found out to be a diagnosis of dyslexia and ADHD. And we were able to rally resources to support this individual. And there was an automatic turnaround in the performance and the outcomes. But the employee shared with myself and the leader of the organization that they weren't comfortable divulging their diagnosis for fear that they would be viewed in a certain light or that people would treat them differently. But when we were able to have an open conversation and find the necessary resources to allow that person to really flourish, they're doing significantly better in the role. There's more energy, there's more enthusiasm coming to work. There's a level of support that wasn't there before. And when missteps happen, there's a different conversation that aligns than compared to, well, I'm going to write you up, or this is something that can't happen again. There's this consideration of, okay, how can we do this differently going forward? What does support look like? I'm knowing that the person is still capable of doing the work.
That's a really great example. And you made it sound so easy and that it flowed. I'm sure for many employers, that's probably not necessarily they may feel comfortable with, and they may have HR people that can help and guide them. But when I think about employers, Carla, that may not have that kind of support or just simply may not have that experience to have those conversations, what are some things managers can do to prepare themselves for conversations like that?
I mean, it's a skill, right? When you mentioned earlier, 7 in 10 senior level employees say they have not received workplace training around this topic, right? Part of it is when we think about transactional experiences in the workplaces versus transformational, right? So, in today's work world, especially in fully remote settings, a lot of the conversations are more transactional, right? Project-based, work-based, and less human, unless there's intention to actually do that check-in, like Rob mentioned, from an authentic, intentional place. And that's part of it, is being better noticers. I like to use that term a lot. Like, how can we be better noticers of not just what someone's doing in their role, from a work perspective or topic, but beyond that, really looking holistically, right? Like, connecting dots, taking notes of, like, wait a minute, I remember that, that colleague mentioning that his or her, their parent or child has not been doing well, or need a procedure. Like, writing notes. I'm a big fan, and I use Google Docs a lot and Excel, and I have like notes of like people I've connected with and just like human messages they've shared with me. And then I create follow-ups and say, oh, let me make sure I check in with that person. And so as leaders, like even just keeping a journal, like if you're meeting with your team, as a manager biweekly or weekly, and they mention something that's unrelated to work that may just seem very simple, integrating that into the next conversation and being curious and authentic, of course, is going to be really important. But that changes. I call those like relationship deposits. Right? And that's what allows enough of those deposits is going to then help that person down the road. And maybe even in the moment when they're considering, do I mention that I'm struggling? Maybe I, need additional support or resources. It's like you've made enough deposits to feel like to that person, I can trust you because I'm pretty sure you really do care about me as a person, not just as a worker, right? And that doesn't happen in transactional types of relationships, right? And so I think that's the first thing. I mean, there's a lot of people struggling with mental health disorders, but not everyone is as well, right? So I think there's the like folks that, how can we support them so that they don't end up feeling isolated, lonely in, tandem with everything else that might be going on in their own personal lives. So how can we prevent, mitigate, and support, right? So I think there's the proactiveness piece. And then there's the piece where can we notice when folks are struggling because we're seeing patterns, we're seeing things that, we're noticing may have been overlooked as, maybe something you write a PIP plan for or PIP plan, but it's really not, right? Maybe it's actually something else going on. So like double clicking, being, authentically curious is really key. Now, I think too, both of you are probably thinking I think everyone has a communication styles that vary, right? And so that also matters. I mean, you know the super nurturing folks by nature, and then there's folks that maybe are just wired to think about like, what's the plan or what's the next project? And so there is that acquired skill for sure of empathy and, communication styles that I'm sure we can talk about for hours.
And Ro, I know you've done a lot of work in that space. And I loved the way Carla used that term, authentically curious. What are some things that you have recommended or have seen employers do to be intentional about carving out those moments to check in on the person?
To my personal experience, even as an employee here at Exude, my leadership has taken time to account for significant dates in my journey and to check in. And that in and of itself was such a refreshing experience to know that someone else already identified something that may have been a hard day for me and lended extra support or just an extra check-in from colleagues. And that makes, the work experience that much more cohesive. What I've seen clients do is start some of their like team meetings with a exercise that is not relative to the work. Let's do a people check-in. How are you? Describe how you're feeling in one word. What's going on? How can I support you? I've seen leaders leverage their one-on-one times with employees to get out of their normal workspace, to go somewhere else. When they're working in a office environment, they move their conversations to a coffee shop or a lunch, over lunch, something to change the environment so that the person may feel a little bit more relaxed to share. And then I think the one that I think is most important is a lot of leaders that I've worked with are very intentional about studying and being made aware of what mental health is, what some of the diagnoses are, things that we don't even consider, and how to better support. So there's an intentionality in leaders that want to learn more and do more just because they want to support their staff. And for those that are unsure, they don't want to make a misstep and make things worse. So it's how can I do something to help in the moment? And if I'm not sure, how to reach out for help.
Can I add something to that, Allison, that I think is important too when we think about how we prepare managers and really organizations? A lot of our human service clients, for example, they're trauma informed, and that's how they apply the work, in terms of the community and the people they're serving. I really do strongly believe that every leader, regardless of your industry, should have some trauma awareness competency of knowing, how does this show up? First of all, normalizing that every human There's no way you get through life without big T trauma or little T traumas, right? And what's that look like? Now, little T traumas happen all the time in the workplaces, and we can call it microaggressions. We can call it, so we think about it through that context of as a leader, how does that interplay of my own lived experiences now impacting how I'm showing up potentially and, activating possibly someone else unintentionally, right? And so what are those signs and symptoms? What are those behaviors? And now, not to, train folks to be therapists per se, but having that more humanized context that it makes sense that some of these behaviors may be showing up, and what can I do to support versus continue to, have this person experience unsafety, for example, right? And so I think that that's a bold move that I've seen. We've worked with organizations that are already taking that leap to say, you know what, this is really important. Of course, I think there's a preparedness and sort of how do you continue sustaining that and a norm. And then obviously policies too, right? I mean, that's a big part of, I know, the work that you folks do, but just really aligning policies with what we're trying to say we're modeling, right? There's like congruency there that really needs to matter.
Carla, go ahead, Ro.
I think to your point around policy, I definitely can agree with that. I've worked with several clients that have policies in place that, offer significant amounts of time off and PTO and vacation and things like that. But the practice of the organization is not to take the time. Mm-hmm. So what I've seen in recent, probably in the last year, is a lot of leadership modeling the utilization of time off to rest and rejuvenate and really make it okay to take the vacation time. Because a lot of people, they say, take a week off, people think about all of the work they're coming back to. And it creates a heightened level of anxiety sometimes. And it's like, well, it's not even worth me taking off, or I'm going to take the time off and I'm still going to check email and do that. But I've seen a lot of leaders give instruction that when you're taking time off, you should be off, and to disconnect and unplug, and making sure employees know that that is okay, that the vacation time and the PTO time is there as a resource for them to rest, rejuvenate, and recharge themselves, and that it is okay to take and allow them to take it in its totality.
I appreciate that, and I think that's a strong way to demonstrate that you truly do, walk the talk. Like if you can see leaders actively doing what they say you can do, it creates that safe space. Ro, you and I had some conversation prior to this session around the impact on culture, and you brought up a really interesting question that I would love for you to ask Carla so she can share her insights with regards to implications around culture.
Sure. So, Carla, my question is, what cultural implications or considerations might employers consider when they're offering mental health resources and or recommendations?
Yeah, there should never be a one-size-fits-all mindset when it comes to implementing any kind of program, specifically relating to this topic of mental health. Let's just use like anxiety as an example, right? As a diagnosis, for example. I mean, how people experience that varies, right? Whether it's the cultural, context, whether it's because my lived experience is different than your lived experience, because my needs are different, because I'm a single mother and you have different life circumstances. So it's really looking at it from, having an offering or programming or resources that can be catered to a wide range of folks. So one example specifically, this has been coming up a lot in my conversations, and I've supported a few organizations in going more towards the boutique EAP kind of approach. So we all know EAP obviously is effective in having that offering and program. What we're finding is that some of our clients are looking towards like, how can we work with a specific practice that has a more diverse range of practitioners, right? So whether, I can identify and relate to this person, whether It's really a wide range, right? Whether it's age, whether it's culture, whether all types of diversity. So it's kind of interesting when we think about like how someone could feel more safe, right? Connecting with someone who has related experiences or values or beliefs. And I think that's one of the things to consider when we're thinking about cultural implications. And back to training, because I think this is really key as far as leaders and how, we can even take a pause and reflect on, I'm going to throw like sociology in here, like our sociological imagination of like when we actually together think about like what brought me to this like point in my life, right? How I was raised, who were my mentors, like socioeconomically. I mean, all of these like levers, right? And experiences affect how we see our world and how we see other people. And I've done an exercise with clients where, it's kind of a fun interactive game where we really kind of explore who we are, right, in our identity. And I find that creates that bridge of like, oh, now I could kind of see a little bit better through your lens. And so when we're thinking about supporting each other, right, it's like kind of being a little bit more competent in someone else's language, right, so that we can come together. So it's that willingness to kind of be more curious as well. But yeah, going back to my point, no one size fits all. If that's all that anyone takes away from this, that is a failed approach. If we just think there's a set it and forget it program for mental health, doesn't exist. It's not going to work.
Carla, what do you say to the employer who says, look, I'm not trained to do that. I'm not trained to be a psychologist. I don't know what to do here. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's kind of thinking about it in a way that you're in that role, and regardless if you can resist, and we're not training people, by the way, to be psychologists unless they want to take that on as far as their own professional growth. Having competency, proficiency, awareness is key because you're in there. And so regardless, you're working with folks and, engaging them, hopefully coaching them, motivating them, and leading the way. And so to assume that their other parts of themselves and their experiences isn't going to interplay with work in your conversations is kind of like going in without the skills that you need to be more effective, right? It's not that we're going to fix people. And I think we really need to park that idea that we're, as leaders, we're here to solve and coddle people. It's not that, right? We're resource providers, right? We're here to be noticers so that we can help guide people along the way or connect them with folks that, whether it's even just not necessarily mental health, but maybe there's skills and competencies or support they need from another team member that they can benefit from. So that alone could also mitigate stress, right? So I think it's thinking about how it makes us more effective when we have those skills as managers and leaders to be able to better support, connect with other folks. It actually reduces our stress levels too, right? Because now we feel like there's an arsenal, there's a toolkit, and I know which ones to use. I see the world through a more holistic lens. I can understand this person and deepen that relationship, which is making my life easier because now our dynamic is improved as well. And there's sort of a win-win, right? So I feel like I'm making meaningful impact in this person's life, helping them get the support they need. Better listening skills, for example, is just all that it is. But even that can go a long way. So yeah, no expectation at all. I hear you on like, that's a lot of pressure that folks these days can sort of expect on or put on themselves of like, I'm not a therapist. And how many of you have, like, I'm sure you've heard that from managers, like, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm a therapist, like, HR folks, right? For sure. And to echo on this, like even more so, definitely not, I think is the role is not to be a therapist, but to be more empathetic and better equipped to listen effectively and provide resources. Really, that's all it is. That's our role in the gift that we give to our colleagues.
As we, you're making me think about hundreds of other questions that could make this podcast go on for hours. But in the spirit of helping our listeners think about what are some action steps or tips that they can do or apply now. And I'd love to ask each of you this. Carla, I'll start with you. What are a few tips that you can share or best pieces of advice that you can share with our listeners to to really address this significant workplace issue around mental health?
Yeah, I'm thinking about like the low level, like the low hanging fruit ones, and I'm thinking, well, no, my gut's like, we need to like really address the system. And so, it's easy to say you should add this program or this app or this benefit, but I always go back to, well, it's likely not going to be utilized as well and sustainable if there's cracks in the foundation. All right, and so the best practice way that I would recommend, and then we could share some resources, is really looking at it and assessing the entire, sort of employee experience from that mental health well-being lens, right? I have a lot of fun and I get so curious in really understanding what are the systemic barriers that are preventing employees from actually feeling safe to speak up, right? So a lot of times there's opportunities at the manager level. It could be policies. It could be norms that were unintentionally developed that just became norms, like sending emails at night became a norm, even though the policy says don't do that, right? And so just those micro opportunities, but do require some digging, some conversations. Of course, that's going to take more time and resources. And I often will tell clients, like, this kind of exploration, you need to be ready to respond to it, because a lot of times we will find opportunities that you may not actually be ready to address, right? So it's kind of like, just got to make sure you're ready to go there. As far as programming, I'll share a couple of, one specifically that I found to be really helpful. There's a whole new like mental health, emotional well-being resource category of offerings called peer support. Those, I don't even know, it's not like EAP, but it's more like peer support. So, compared to like an EAP or using behavioral health services, this would be, almost like a network of folks who have lived experiences similar to you. So it's kind of like you fill out a little form. Life guides, I'll throw in one vendor or provider specifically that we've partnered with, and they're fabulous, and they've done a lot of vetting of their peer specialists. So, let's say, I have specific needs or identify as X, Y, and Z, and then they pair you up with someone who might, like, who've had similar lived experience. So it's kind of like a buddy system where, they're trained as coaches. So it's not just like, venting or, it's productive relationships, but you feel seen, you feel heard. And it's really great for folks who may still have that stigma. Could be cultural, right? And that might not necessarily be from the organization projecting that stigma, but maybe it's like, no, I don't need a therapist unless I'm in crisis, but I can see someone who's, sees eye to eye, who I feel is actually maybe even more credible because they've had lived experience with this condition, or knows what it's like to be in that sandwich generation, struggling to care for kids and aging parents, like, whatever it is. It's so interesting and fascinating. And I so appreciate the range of topics that you can really, kind of get support around. So that, I think, would be like a nice add-on layer to a program that employers may be thinking about, because there is that loneliness challenge that I'm sure we've all heard about, right? People feeling more isolated and sometimes that means they don't feel comfortable even going to their own family members or closest friends, right? Just relationships have definitely shifted a lot in recent years too, dynamics around that. So I think that's a really good one to consider. And then, of course, behavioral health services are always a top priority. Accessibility, I would say, is probably more important to think about when it comes to behavioral health. Like when I'm looking at vendors or programs, like how many calls or, whatever digging do I have to do to actually find someone I can speak to, right? Like a lot of times you get like a list of 50 providers in your area. It's like, if someone's in crisis, come on, like to have the mental load of having to call people, figure, are you still taking patients? And then are we a match? It's like dating, right? Like, it's like, do I feel connected to you? So just having a service where it really allows that matching and that connection in a very short window of time as much as possible, I think is really critical for addressing those who might be in that more time-sensitive need.
Ro, what about you? What are some tips you have based on the work that you do and what employers could do?
I think the opportunity to really utilize active and reflective listening, to very much be intentional about waiting for the responses to the normally polite question that's asked. How are you today? Listen with intent. Listen with a open mind to understand what the employee is going through. Give them the space to do that. When a person genuinely feels that someone is caring authentically about their experience, they're more likely to share. What I've seen done in a few organizations, managers have leveraged having coffee chats, especially with their virtual teams. Not work related, not project related. It's just a 15-minute check-in. Let's have a sip of coffee together. Tell me what's going on in your world. How are things? If there's recent social unrest or things on the news, that's conversation. If the person lives in an area where there was just a major incident, that could be topic of conversation to help them kind of unpack what they're feeling, because the external factors are always going to be there. So I think leaders leveraging an opportunity to actively listen and show empathy. Again, I've heard the same spiel. I'm not a therapist. I get it all the time. I'm not a therapist, bro. What am I supposed to do? Listen and find out ways to support, and then recommend the resources. Educate your employees about the resources that are available. And I would say 70% of the clients that I work with, more than half of the employees do not know what their EAP benefits are. They don't even know how to access them or how to utilize them. So I think even offering that as a support is something that leaders can do just to make their employees aware of the things that are there to assist them.
I loved both of your advice, and I think those employee assistance programs, making them accessible, keeping them front of mind, pointing out that there are things that they offer that are beyond that, things like child care locators or elder care support services that may take time, that creates anxiety because you don't have the time to do your job and to look for those kinds of things. So there are other pieces built in that could help. I know someone who's listening to this is probably going to ask you the question that I'm about to ask you. Where do I find the time to have these conversations? Where do I find the time in my busy day to have a conversation to help someone get through something so that they can actually do the job? What do you say to that?
I think it's a real problem. I think that in itself is data. Like the way I see that, if when someone's coming to us and sharing that's a struggle, I'm curious. All right, what's getting in the way of you not having time, right? And that also to me, infers there's likely not a lot of time for that individual to take care of themselves. So how to expect someone to care for someone else and have the empathy and have the lens of inclusion is already, that ability and capacity is diminished, right? Because when our needs aren't met, we're usually in self-preservation mode, and it's usually about me, because we're in survival mode, right? And so I think that's important, right? When we're hearing that often, and especially with like various individuals in the same organization, I think that's an opportunity to just explore it a little bit and say, interesting, okay, like what's creating this, right? This is a symptom, and there is something underlying, right? So are there norms? Are there policies? Are there, what's there and what needs to be addressed? And so I think that acknowledging is always important in any situation, right? And someone's coming to me, that is a real experience for you, right? And so your colleague may look like they're way more productive, but to you, that is a real problem. So how can we address that? I think there's an important message when we're talking about mental health, especially in the context of like managers supporting employees. A big part of what I like to do with our conversations with our clients is to ensure that if we're expecting leaders to do more work, we should also be doing something for them to deposit into their self-care bucket. And so everything that, we do has an integration of self-care and well-being for leaders, because to expect to take on more, these conversations are heavy, they're hard, and they're triggering, right? I think that we really got to be honest with that, because as much as we just want to say, let's just help people, like when we're dealing with our own lived experiences and our own challenges and all the things that people don't see is going on within our lives. And then we're going to lean into difficult conversations and helping someone who might have a situation that actually could be activating for me, right? Like, so I think there's that acknowledgement of like a system support. That you can't be like individuals going in and expecting that we're just cleaning up, all over the place and we're on our own. It's kind of like, well, I can lean on on someone else maybe, or I could feel that support so that I have the capacity to also, like, you might need to tap out and tap someone else in, right? There are times where seasons of life change. I mean, we're going to go through phases where we're going to have more capacity mentally, emotionally, and some days where we're going to need someone to pick us up too, right? And so I think humans are so complex, and I really believe in a systems approach to this kind of work.
Ro, how would you answer that question? I don't have time for this.
I always encourage leaders to find the time, because what happens is if you don't make the time, you might lose the person, and then you're going to be using that time to backfill and interview and go through all of the process of trying to get a new person in that role. So what I do with a lot of the leaders that I support, I ask them to figure out what they can do and then what they can delegate to someone else to free up time on their calendar. I have this conversation around supporting employees. I have this conversation around time management with trying to help leaders build inclusive cultures. How do I have these hard conversations? How do I connect with my people? How do I factor it in? And just like we build in meeting time to engage with projects and individuals, I encourage leaders to carve out time. Make it a point that Friday afternoons, I'm not talking to any clients. I'm not talking to any employees. I'm connecting with my team. This is the time. There's opportunity there for us to juggle and reprioritize things, and then offer some things off of our plates. To Carla's point, lean in for support within your organization. What can I partner with another colleague to get a project done? How can I empower one of my leads on my team to take on additional responsibilities, to offer them an opportunity to learn something new in partnership with me as a leader that will afford me time to connect with my team? So what can I do? What can I delegate? How can I find a balance between the two?
Can I add something real quick to that? It just made me think of another sort of complement to that, bro, is, I almost want to invite folks to think about, the architect of your work, right? And designing your work. And so how could we be more strategic, creative in integrating well-being type of experiences and check-ins and those humanistic kind of experiences for our teams that could be scalable? For example, like the start of the meeting, right, that you mentioned, Ro, of, just chiming in, like right from the get-go. Maybe even ending, like I'm noticing a trend of, maybe you've seen it too, like scheduling meetings for 50 minutes instead of an hour, right? Giving that transition time. So even just the design of how we do things can also foster and support this message that we care. So we may not have lots of time to have conversations and check-ins, but if we're in groups or we're in one-on-ones already, and that already happens, right? How can you leverage existing blocks of time, right, and integrate just minute segments or, even 2 minutes that can really save? And also from a mental load of like, when am I going to make that time? It's already scheduled. It's already going to happen, right? So that's just another way to look at it.
And I think that's great advice. I thank you both so much, for sharing some of these tips. I know that it can feel overwhelming to people who are both leaders in organizations who are helping individuals on their teams move through these moments of mental health. And it can feel overwhelming to the individual who's trying to show up and trying to do what they can do to be the best that they can be, but just really struggling with something. So I hope that our listeners can take away a couple of nuggets of information that the two of you have shared today. And I just want to thank you both so much. Chief Wellbeing Officer at Exude Benefits, Carla Chin, thank you.
Pleasure.
And
you.
And senior consultant with Exude Human Capital, Romaine Jones-Wise. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you on our next podcast or hearing you on our next podcast. Until next time.